Good afternoon, and thank you for being here for the Women in Politics Symposium. I'm Sarah Bowden from Iowa Public Radio. Karen Mason is curator of the Louise Noun Mary Louise Smith Iowa Women's Archives at the University of Iowa Libraries, a position she's held since the establishment of the archives in 1992. Let me try this again. Karen Mason is curator of the Louise Noun and Mary Louise Smith Iowa Women's Archives at the University of Iowa Libraries, a position she's held since the establishment of the archives in 1992. She earned a bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr College, a master's in history from the University of Minnesota, and in 1991, a PhD in American history from the University of Michigan. Her dissertation was entitled Testing the Boundaries, Women, Politics, and Gender Roles in Chicago, 1880 to 1930. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Sarah. It's my great honor today to introduce Senator Amy Klobuchar. I am a native Minnesotan. Yes, I confess. 22 years ago, I moved to Iowa City to begin the work of preserving the history of Iowa women through their scrapbooks, photographs, writings, and other material. The Iowa Women's Archives, located on the third floor of the main library at the university, is now bursting with documents that tell the history of Iowa women, from farmers to policewomen to artists. Many of the collections tell the story of Iowa women's participation in political life, whether fighting for suffrage in the 19th century, educating voters through the League of Women Voters, or working on political campaigns or serving in office at the local, county, and state levels. The Iowa Women's Archives does not, however, have any records of women who served in Congress or as governor of Iowa, and you all know the reason for that. Iowa shares the distinction with only 3 other states of never having elected a woman to Congress or to the governorship. This is not the case in our neighbor state of Minnesota, which boasts 1 female senator and 2 women in the House of Representatives. I grew up in Minnesota, and I still have sky blue water running through my veins, although it's getting a little muddy now with the black and gold mixing in. I'm proud of my native state for recognizing that the sky will not fall if we elect women to Congress, and indeed that Congress will be stronger and perhaps more effective the more women we elect. And I look forward to the day when the Iowa Women's Archives receives a truckload of files from our first congresswoman or senator. When I was growing up in Minneapolis, the name Klobuchar was a household word. I remember coming home from school, stretching out on the living room floor, opening up the Minneapolis Star, and reading Jim Klobuchar's column. For me and for many Minnesotans, the name Klobuchar was synonymous with witty writing, insightful commentary, and good journalism. Klobuchar is still a household word in Minnesota, but now it's taken on a new meaning. In 2006, Amy Klobuchar, the daughter of Jim Klobuchar, became the first woman elected to represent the state of Minnesota in the United States Senate. A former prosecutor, Senator Klobuchar has worked to pass consumer product safety legislation, authored legislation to help small businesses tap into new markets abroad, and championed an amendment aimed at boosting funds for STEM education for American students. She chairs the Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights, where she has worked to advance policies that protect consumers from anti-competitive behavior and make sure businesses are able to compete on a level playing field. Throughout her public service, Senator Klobuchar has built a reputation of putting partisanship aside to help strengthen the economy and support families, workers, and businesses. She was part of a bipartisan group of 14 senators that worked to end the government shutdown last year. Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. And was a member of the Farm Bill Conference Committee that crafted the final farm bill that was recently signed into law. Her work has gained national recognition. The American Prospect named her a woman to watch, and Working Mother magazine named her a best in Congress for her efforts on behalf of working families. She received an award from the Service Women's Action Network for her efforts to fight sexual assault in the military, and the Disabled American Veterans has also honored her for working to improve the lives of American veterans. Today, Senator Klobuchar is among a record 20 women serving in the U.S. Senate, alongside 76 women in the House of Representatives. But she wants that number to grow because she believes that women in office make a difference. She's currently leading a national effort to position more female candidates for victory in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Senator Amy Klobuchar.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is what happens to everyone from Minnesota when they go to Iowa, right? But thank you for this great welcome on such a beautiful day. And it was just fun walking around the campus and seeing everyone in this really pretty room. And we had a great lunch today, and I wanted to especially thank Karen for her nice introduction. And then also I know there's a number of state legislators here who have been here, including Republican and Democratic, which is great. State Senator Ann Sinclair and Representative Mary Masher and Sally Stutzman and Nancy Butker and one guy, Jack Hatch, okay? So there you go. We always leave the men till last when we're with the women senators. But I just want to thank everyone for sponsoring this event, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, the Women in Politics, the Iowa Women's Archives, and all of the other sponsors. And I do bring you greetings from the state of Minnesota. We're, in the words of our not official poet laureate Garrison Keillor, the women are strong, right? The men are good looking. You can ask Franken about that. And all the women leaders are above average. So we have... I think you all know we have made incredible strides in Washington and across the country in putting women into leadership positions, from the boardroom to the classroom to the State House and beyond. Women's contributions to our economies have completely changed in the last few years. In fact, 7.3 million American families now rely solely on the income of women working outside the home. That is a lot of families. I put that report out as chair of the Joint Economic Committee in the Senate, and one of the most outstanding figures for you in Iowa was that we did a state-by-state breakdown. We found that 74% of kids in Iowa have a mom who works outside the home. It is the highest percentage in the nation, okay? So that is an amazing fact. Many of the women that we're going to talk about today are blazing trails in areas historically thought of as the old boys club. The Fortune 500 now has a record 23 women CEOs. It doesn't sound like much when you think of the fact that there are 500 companies, but in 1995, not so long ago, there were not any women CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. We now have 79 women in the House of Representatives in Washington and 20 women in the United States Senate. And I knew we had finally broken ground when the fall after the last few women were elected to the Senate. For the first time in the history of the United States of America, we actually had a traffic jam in the women's senator's bathroom. Okay, like that was it, man. So that was the sign that things have changed. The best part of having 20 women in the Senate is that they now no longer call us Sweet 16. We look out for each other. My favorite story was when I first got to the Senate. There I was in the fancy LBJ room. It's this beautiful room, with sort of gilded room, and we had this fancy lunch there, and there's a big picture of Lyndon Johnson on the wall, a beautiful portrait, and I go and I get my soup and my salad, and I sit down, and I'm at this table with 8 senators. I'm ready to dive in, and it's only Patty Murray, the only other woman at the table, that jumps up from across me, runs around, grabs my arm, and she says, "Amy, you just took the entire bowl of Thousand Island dressing, and you're about to eat it." And I said, "That's what we do in Minnesota. We eat the Thousand Island dressing." But I did think it was somewhat significant that it was only the woman at the table that rescued me from eating the entire bowl of Thousand Island dressing. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit actually to start out here about why we're here and why I know you've had panels on this, but why we think it's so important to have women in the Senate and in the House and more women in positions of power. And I actually believe that women have made incredible leaders. I'm going to give you some of the stories to support that with some of the things that have been going on in the last few years. There's an old saying that women leaders speak softly. I don't agree with that. But women leaders should speak softly and carry a big statistic. And I actually agree with the second part, because I've noticed that when women get into power, they can't exactly just swagger around on a flight deck. This isn't going to quite work. That they actually have to prove what they've done, that they have to show things to be accountable and actually get results. And I've seen that over and over again with how they approach their jobs. When I first was running, actually, for my county attorney job, I had not many mentors. No one had ever done that job, and not many women had been in power in Minnesota. So I would look at the website of then Janet Napolitano, who was, I believe, the Arizona Attorney General, and I noticed how she would put her goals and what the results were on the website. I'm like, I can do that too. And so women have just tended to do this. You think about Hillary Clinton, you think about Kathleen Sebelius when she was governor of Kansas. There's just a big emphasis on setting out what they're going to do and then showing how you do it and getting it done and having that be the accomplishment. With that said, I think you all know it has not been easy to get things done in Congress in the last few years. The lowest moment for me was actually before the shutdown was the fiscal cliff night, which was about a year and a half ago on New Year's Eve. And there we were, the entire Senate of this country, at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, voting on to try to save the country from going over this cliff because we'd had such fights leading up to it. And I thought, you can't get much lower than midnight on New Year's Eve, that magic moment. And I looked to my left and I saw Harry Reid. I looked to my right and I see Mitch McConnell, every girl's dream, okay, at midnight. And I thought, you know, it doesn't really get much worse than this. But in fact, then we got into the shutdown, which, as you know, cost this country at least $24 billion with goods that weren't approved to get exported overseas, with restaurants and hotels that had to shut down by our national parks, and we could just go on and on about the problems with that shutdown. And as Karen mentioned, a group of us came together under the leadership of Senator Susan Collins, a Republican of Maine, and included half women in the group. Which I just think is no coincidence. And we came up with some ideas and brought them to both leaders of how we thought we could get out of the shutdown. And actually our idea was to have a very short leash on the time that we'd have an interim agreement, because we could then ride the momentum of the public anger, frankly, at the Congress for getting us in the shutdown to be able to then get us out of it with a longer-term budget agreement. Because I remember at the time people said, why do you only want this to last 2 to 3 months? And I said, well, if we really want a long-term thing, you have to use this moment in time where people have gotten so angry. And so that's what we did, and they basically took a lot of those ideas. They ended up in the final agreement. And then we went from there. And if you look at what happened since then, it's a kind of a very good view of where women are right now. It was Patty Murray who led the effort then with Congressman Ryan in the House, Patty Murray who led the effort in the Senate to get an agreement for a budget framework going forward. She was is head of the Budget Committee. So we got that done, which surprised a lot of people. And then only 2 months later, Barbara Mikulski, who's the first woman chair of the Appropriations Committee, was able to reach an agreement with the House on a budget that actually got rid of half of the sequestration cuts and put us on some firm footing. We got through, of course, all of the other budget issues, and we're able to actually get to a point where we're not careening from budget crisis to budget crisis over the next 2 years. So I just give you an example of that. That was all women leading the way. In the meantime, during the last few months, any success we've had, the Farm Bill was led by Senator Debbie Stabenow. You look back over the last year or so, it was Senator Gillibrand and Senator McCaskill with slightly different views who helped lead the fight on sexual assault in the military. I led all the women to the floor of the Senate on the Violence Against Women Act when the House bill, we believe, was not nearly strong enough on issues like tribal justice and other things. And we knew we had the House when we got all 20 women senators to vote for that bill. Every Republican and Democratic senator. So And by the way, all 20 women senators, including the Republican women senators, voted to end the shutdown. So this is not just about potluck dinners, as much as we women senators like that, as much as we have fun getting together. It actually is something of a voting bloc, not on every issue, and there's going to be differences on things, but when we do come together like this, it's an incredibly powerful force. Other things I'd mentioned, Barbara Boxer, against all odds, was able to make an agreement with Jim Inhofe on the transportation bill, and that's what gave us the last 2-year transportation bill. And she actually reached an agreement with David Vitter on the Water Resources Development Act, which is now in conference and over in the House, but we were able to pass a very strong bill in the Senate. There are now, this is what's really interesting, there are 8 women chairs in the Senate. I'm one of them with the Joint Economic Committee, out of about 20 or so, depending on how you count it. So in the Senate, the women have actually nearly half of the chairmanships and 2 of 3 of the most powerful chairmanships. So it has made a huge difference with the way the Senate runs. The other thing I think is so important about having women in office, and then I'll get to the challenges of getting them there, is that we tend to focus on, as our Dean Barbara Mikulski likes to say, not just on macro issues, but also on the macaroni and cheese issues. And those are the issues that affect people in their everyday lives. And actually the way I got involved in politics, I was a lawyer at a law firm, was something like that. My daughter was born and she was very, very sick and she couldn't swallow. Everything she drank came out her nose, and they didn't know what was wrong. They thought she might have a tumor. They thought, and she was up all night with these tests. She was in intensive care, and it was back when the insurance companies had a rule that you had to be kicked out in 24 hours. And with her in intensive care, not knowing if she was going to be making it, up all night, they kicked me out of the hospital in 24 hours. And as my husband wheeled me out the door in this wheelchair, I looked at him and I said, this would never happen to the wife of the head of the insurance company. And so my daughter ended up being sick for quite a while, and she's doing great now, but I ended up leading an effort as a citizen. I've had nothing really to do with politics. I'd been involved in a few campaigns, but as a citizen, as a mom, led the effort to get one of the first laws passed in the country guaranteeing new moms and their babies a 48-hour hospital stay. And as you know, that law later went national. There was actually, it was hard to be against, but when we got to the conference committee, there were many lobbyists there trying to delay the implementation of the rule for a year or two. So I decided to bring 6 pregnant friends to the conference committee. I really did this. And when the legislators asked, oh, well, when should this take effect? The 6 pregnant women raised their hand and said, now. And that's what happened. They made it effective that day. So that's how I really got involved in politics and learned that public service matters, and despite all the partisan squabbling that passes as politics in Washington today, I was hooked on politics, and hooked on the kind of politics that Paul Wellstone described as nothing that has to do with left, right, or center, but everything to do with what's right by the people. I had, as I said, not many role models in Minnesota. Betty McCollum had been in the House when I decided. I first ran for county attorney and then decided to run for Senate. And you have to go back, and I'm going to start talking about the challenges, which I know you're talking about today, of getting into this. The best challenge in the world is the story of Koyuk Knutson of Minnesota. And she was the first woman elected from our state in 1954, and she was in a very rural district. And she was in the state legislature doing a good job, and kind of the whole good old boys didn't want her to run and refused to back her when she decided to run for Congress, but she was undeterred and went forward. She barnstormed the 9th Congressional District, drove more than 25,000 miles, delivering 12 speeches a day, and against all odds she won, and she was the first woman to serve on the House of Representatives Agriculture Committee. She was doing a good job. She got the first federal appropriation for cystic fibrosis research passed. She passed legislation that launched the first federal student loan program. She was reelected in 1956. So when she was up again in 1958, the party bosses and people decided this wasn't going to work. So this is what they did. Her political opponents got her husband, Andy, who had a bit of a drinking problem, drunk, back at home, and they got him to write a letter that said, Koya, come home. Basically that he needed her to come home to cook and clean. And they sent it to the Fargo Forum, which covered her area of the state, and they ran a headline that said, "Koyuk, come home," about the note from her husband. And it got picked up. It ran in newspapers nationwide. She later lost the election to a 6'4" Odin Langen, whose campaign slogan was, "A big man for a man-sized job." That is a true story. Okay, I didn't know that till we researched it for this speech, the last part. That is such a good end to the story. So you fast forward 48 years to 2006, when I first ran for the Senate. We'd had 2 women run for the Senate in Minnesota, Ann Winia and Joan Grow. And the themes of their campaigns, they're both very accomplished, one the Secretary of State, one the Majority Leader of the State Senate. And their themes, though, by nature, were a lot about women running for office, that we need a woman in the Senate. And for some reason, it didn't work. And so when I ran, I was asked repeatedly. The view in Minnesota was that a woman couldn't win. It was the strangest thing by newspapers, especially in the rural areas. Well, I don't know, do you think a woman can run? It's 2006. And I point out, well, a woman ran for the Senate and won in Texas, and, you know, there's 2 in California, and they won in Arkansas, so I think so. And they said, well, how are you ever going to get men to support you? I was asked this all the time. And I finally made up this thing that absolutely doesn't really quite make sense, but it seemed to work. I would say, well, I'm not really just running as a woman. I'm running as my experience as a prosecutor and the results I've gotten, because if I just ran as a woman, half the voters are men, and then I wouldn't win. And they go, yeah, I don't know. That's what I would say. I mean, I didn't really say it on TV, but I would say it in these newspaper editorial boards. And I think what I was stressing was that I was proud to run as a woman. I had a lot of women supporters, but I was also running on my experience and what we could get done. So I get elected, and then one of my most memorable experiences in terms of women trying to get positions of power were the 2 Supreme Court justices' hearings. I was on the Judiciary Committee, and I sort of became their de facto person that went on TV. Obviously, they can't. It got to the point where when Elena Kagan came to meet with me, I literally could ask her questions and know the answer because I knew everything about her life because I was defending her on television. And both of those nominations were interesting in 2 different ways from a position of women in power. Sotomayor had more federal judicial experience than any Supreme Court nominee in 100 years. Elena Kagan was different. She hadn't had that judicial experience, all those trials that Sotomayor had, but she was the first woman dean of Harvard Law School, the first woman solicitor general. But during both of their confirmation hearings, some incredibly, I would say, sexist things were discussed. And the undercurrent of the debate, I'm convinced, would not have happened with a male nominee. In Justice Sotomayor's confirmation, with all the stories and comments, most of which were anonymous, there was a lot of questioning of her temperament. This kind of gets to the ladylike discussion that Claire McCaskill had recently in Iowa. And it literally got to the point where I was in the airport after the president had nominated her, and a guy who was just there in the tram with me in Minnesota, and he'd heard the radio a lot, and he said to me, "So you're going to vote for that lady?" And I said, "Do you mean Justice Sotomayor, or at the time Judge Sotomayor?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I don't know how you can do that since she just votes whatever her feelings are." He actually said that to me because of stuff he had heard on the radio. And so it just gave you a sense. And the second rap on her was that she was tough on people that practiced in front of her. And that was a big undercurrent of the debate in Washington, if she was too tough. And I kind of think that's the very definition of a judge, being tough on the people that come before you. And what I loved was right before the confirmation hearings, for some strange reason, Justice Ruth Ginsburg, who rarely does interviews, did an interview with the New York Times, and she was asked about the anonymous comments about Sotomayor, and she said, "Has anyone watched Scalia or Breyer on the bench?" And I think she did that to point out that this is just a ridiculous criticism. Then when Kagan came up, there was questions about her experience, but my one little episode, which I will never forget, was opening the Washington Post on a Sunday, seeing my picture on the front of the style page with Justice Kagan. I'm like, wow, our little discussion we had blown up, you know, like the whole front thing. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. It must be a story on Judge Kagan. Well, underneath it said, unusual. It turned out to be a story about Justice Kagan's clothes being frumpy. And under it said, unusual. See this picture. Most women, including Senator Amy Klobuchar, cross their legs when sitting, but not Elena Kagan. I'm not kidding you. This was 2010, not 1910 or 1810. So it just gives you a sense of what goes on. And my favorite moment from that hearing was when Senator Coburn was kind of going after the nominee, after Kagan, and he actually kept asking her, don't you think we're less free than we were 30 years ago? We're less free than we were 30 years ago. So I only had 3 minutes before my second round of questions were coming up, and I had this whole prepared remarks, but I quickly Googled what was going on 30 years ago, and I was able to ask these questions. I said, well, Solicitor General Kagan, 30 years ago, do you know what the #1 song was? And she says, no. And I said, well, it was Call Me by Blondie. Do you know how many women were in the United States Senate 30 years ago? She says, no, she didn't know. And I said, 1. I said, do you know how many women were on the Judiciary Committee 30 years ago? And she said, I don't know. The answer was 0. And I said, how many women were on the Supreme Court 30 years ago? And she knew that answer was 0. So I turned to the rest of the committee. I looked at Senator Coburn, and I said, Senator Coburn, you know what? Freedom is in the eyes of the beholder. And I think that is what... And I think as we look at these past 30 years, we know that women have made gains and that we're more free to choose what we want to do. But the fact remains that the U.S. is ranked 84th in the world for the percentage of women we have serving in our national legislature. We're not just beat out by countries like Sweden and Netherlands. We rank far behind Rwanda, Nicaragua, and Nepal, and even Iraq and Pakistan have a higher percentage of women serving in the national legislatures than we do in Congress. Women's representation at lower level offices is a much better, slightly more than 24% of state legislative seats are held by women, and only 5 women governors right now in our history. So why is this? I think political scientists, see Catherine Pearson here from Minnesota, and I know there's many others here from Iowa, have all sorts of theories. Maybe it's because women are less interested in holding political office. It's not the most fun job right now. Maybe it's because no one asks us to run. Maybe it's because women are balancing kids and jobs and household chores and barely have enough time to eat and sleep, let alone knock on doors and shake hands. Or maybe it's because we need to spend more time telling our daughters and our granddaughters that they can grow up to be a governor or a president. And it would be really good, I think, if you want to get more women in that pipeline that you talked about today, if they have a role model so that they can believe that they can actually do their jobs. So when I look at this issue, I actually am asked a lot about how you advise young women to run for office, and I finally went to the extreme. Cosmopolitan magazine, it might not be where you would think I would be published in, but it is the biggest women's magazine with the circulation of 18 million, and I deliberately didn't bring the cover because of some of the titles of the articles in it. But they asked me if I would do an interview, kind of a column on how to get women to take more power and run for office. So I said I would, and my favorite thing is the title. It's in this May issue, and it's called Work Hard and Love It. It's okay. And I gave some advice in Cosmo that I will give you today in a little different way. But I think, first of all, is that so often when you're asked to do these things, women actually confront low expectations. People actually think you can't do the job. I certainly had that in law enforcement when they were so used to men doing the jobs. And so what I would tend to do is use those low expectations to my advantage, because if they have low expectations, they're much easier to exceed them and to prove that they're wrong. And I think it's really, really important that no matter what people think that you can't do this job, or you couldn't be, the ag commissioner because it's more of a men's job, or you can't be the police chief, if you keep your own expectations high, it really makes a difference, and you can actually beat out those low expectations just by doing a good job. Literally, when I first got in my prosecutor job, just by going to the police meetings, which my predecessor hadn't been doing for a while, that was like, they thought, wow, she's pretty good. And so I just think that you have to try to use those to your advantage and not let it bring you down. The second thing is this idea that I talked about a little, is just this idea that you can't always start at the top, and that women have to get used to this idea that if they're going to go up the pipeline, they may have to first run for a job that they want to do, but it may not be their dream job, right? In fact, my first job in politics was doing I was an intern for Vice President Mondale for the summer, and I showed up all excited to write policy memos and things like that, and he literally assigned me, his office did, to doing the furniture inventory, and I had to crawl under every single desk to write down the serial number, and it took 3 weeks, I learned two things from that experience. The first was that the Vice President was very honest, nothing was missing, but the second was that you always have to try to do well in whatever you are trying out for, and that includes whether people can get themselves in as a manager of a school board race or running for some kind of water board. You just always try to do your best, because I can tell you one thing, that job for Walter Mondale was my first job in Washington, and this was my second. So, you know, I think that that is really important, because sometimes they just think, well, I can't run for Senate, and they don't even think that you kind of can start and then work your way up. The next piece of advice is to surround yourself with people who are supportive, and I think this is part of the Lean In book that Sheryl Sandberg has written that I like, and I'm glad she's taken on this issue of women in business, and that you have to push for things, and you also want to have it. She has her husband's actually from Minnesota. I know her mother-in-law quite well, and is a leader actually with this group called PACER, with parents of kids with disabilities. And she writes a lot about her husband growing up and his mom in the book. And I think having someone who's very supportive, any kind of partner or your family in any race is important, especially for a woman if you're trying to break the barriers. It doesn't have to be that way, but you always can find someone around you that's supportive. My husband has been great and helped me raise our daughter. He's the one that had to do a lot of the driving around when I'd be at late night votes. He's the one that ended up having to take my daughter to find her tankini for the 8th grade pool party when I had to cancel because we had a national security vote, which was my lowest moment of not being able to balance things when I left him at the Target dressing room with her, and she called in tears, sobbing that her dad wouldn't let her get a tankini because he didn't understand what, while the school said you couldn't wear a bikini, you could wear a tankini, and he didn't know the difference between them. Mom, when you get on? So I grabbed the phone, and I'm like, what are you doing? There's a difference between a tankini and a bikini. And I run right into Lindsey Graham coming out of the vote and like knock him over. I'm like, I am not doing that well at this. But through it all, my husband has been incredible. And I will tell you that he is the first guy in the history of the Senate, again, that got intimately involved in the Senate Spouse Club. This was a traditionally, like, let's just say Bill Clinton and Bob Dole didn't have a lot to do with it. And he started going to the meetings every single week when he first got to Washington. Now he's teaching, can't be there all the time. And he would go to every single meeting. And he got so involved, they put him on the hospitality committee for the First Ladies' Luncheon, and he got to sit next to Laura Bush at the First Ladies' Luncheon. And I did know things were out of hand one day that Claire McCaskill and I were driving out of the Capitol, and she looks out the window, and she goes, "Isn't that your husband out there walking along the ground with a pink box?" And I go, "Yes, it is." So I roll down the window. I go, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, it's a Senate Spouse Club event. I'm going to Jim Webb's wife's baby shower." Yes, this was like a true victory for equality. So I think, having someone that's supportive matters. I think the other thing that pulls women back sometimes for running is that they're afraid of being attacked, especially in this day and age. And I think the answer there is you just have to steel yourself and have to realize that so many times the good of passing a bill that matters to your state or doing something to help a little girl that got killed in a swimming pool, and knowing you can call that dad and say, "I just passed a swimming pool bill that makes sure this will never happen again to other kids," that it makes it all worth it. But part of it is fighting back. And you think about the way some of these incredible women have fought back in the last few years. Elizabeth Warren gets denied by the Senate Republicans, get blocked from leading the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So what does she do? She turns around and runs against their Republican senator in Massachusetts and wins, okay? So, it happens. Or Or you look at when Claire McCaskill got accused of being unladylike and had the whole deal with Todd A. I'm not going to go into that whole race and what happened in Missouri, but she just used it to her advantage and took it on and won. Or one of my favorite examples was during the Finance Committee hearing on the health care bill, and there was some discussion by a bunch of guys about whether maternity care should be covered in with some of the mandatory benefits. And one of the guys said, well, I don't know why that would be a mandatory benefit. I never used maternity benefits. And Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, without missing a beat, looked across at him and said, I bet your mother did. And they got included. So it's just finding those moments to fight back in different ways, which I think is so important, to fight back not only when there's sexist comments, so you're helping other women, but it's also fighting back for what you believe in and understanding that that's part of the process, and sometimes it's unfair, and especially to a lot of women, it just seems ugly. But there is so much good that can come out of it, and remembering it, and also remembering that there are good people to work with on both sides of the aisle. I have one of the highest percentages, I think almost the highest, of senators, not just women senators, working and introducing bills with Republicans, and I have the highest one of working with House Republicans. And I think that there is a lot of good that can come out of it. And I guess my last piece of this, again, would be to just go back to keeping your expectations high. When I first ran for county attorney, no one gave me a chance. I was running against a congressman's sister, actually, who had 4 times the money that I did. And I ended up putting up 3,000 lawn signs. I did 29 parades, and I did 75 pancake breakfasts. And I ended up winning with being outspent 4-1 by less than 2 votes per precinct. And I always thought if I just did 60 pancake breakfasts, I wouldn't have made it. And so I think that those kinds of things where you can actually win despite the money and can stand up to what are now these 24/7 attack fests and these super PACs and all these things that can make a difference. And I literally stand before you as the granddaughter of an iron ore miner and the daughter of a newspaperman and a teacher and the first woman elected to the Senate from Minnesota. So I believe these things can happen. So I will end with that expectation message, and then would love to take questions. I just heard from my daughter this morning. She's now 18 and a freshman in college, so I told her I would tell this story. But when she was 4 years old, she had a friend over, and they were playing with dolls. The girl was a little older, and I walked by her room, and I heard the girl say, well, one day soon I'm going to have a baby just like this doll. And I thought, oh, what's my daughter going to say? I kind of stood out there holding some towels, and I heard her say, well, I'm going to have a baby too, but not for a long, long time, because you cannot have a baby until you run for office and win an election. I'm like, those are high expectations. So that is what we need to think about with women running for office, is those high expectations, even in Cosmo magazine. So, all right, very good. So, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Wow. They never get that excited in Minnesota. Thank you.
If you have questions for Senator Klobuchar, you can signal Leslie, and you can write your question on a note card, and then she'll bring it to me. So our first question is, how does hyper-partisanship affect the intent and ability of women to run for office?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's what I was getting to at the end there. Women tend to be, just my experience with the candidates, they actually want to run to get things done. There's plenty of men that are like that too, but it dominates the thinking of women. I think they also get more worried than men about being prepared. That they think they have to know everything before they run for office, or they're going to be caught up and caught unawares. And I think that's a good thing, but it holds some of them back. And certainly in a hyper-partisanship situation where they're more and more concerned about what can happen to them if they get attacked, then they're less likely to move forward and decide to run because they think they're going to be more vulnerable. So I think the answer to that is, first of all, some of the advice I just gave on the fact that you have to be ready for these attacks are going to happen, and you just have to do all your research and know how you're going to defend yourself, so you're ready to go. You have to take some humor on the whole thing. I remember when I first ran for county attorney, I actually was at first running against a Democrat, and so it was kind of a heated little race in the caucuses, which is something you guys in Iowa know a little bit about. And I remember one morning on Memorial Day, and it was like 6 a.m., the phone rang, and this woman whispering to disguise her voice says, "Everyone in the DFL party knows that you have a live-in boyfriend." I still remember this. And I said, for some reason, I had the wherewithal to make a joke out of it. I said, "Could you please keep your voice down? My husband is sleeping right next to me, and I don't want him to hear it." And so I just think on these fronts, you have to have some humor about these attacks, some of which are completely outrageous and outlandish. And remember that. And then you have to have in your inner core in this hyper-partisanship know why you're doing it. Otherwise, it just gets depressing, because then all you're doing is just being partisan on your own side and partisan. If you don't have some things that you want to accomplish, if all you want to do is go and stand by yourself in the United States Senate and give a speech and read Green Eggs and Ham, okay, no, you don't have to do that, but you just want to go and stand by yourself and give a speech, I just don't think you can't really combat the hyper-partisanship. I think you've got to be willing to stand next to someone you don't always agree with for the betterment of this country, and that's what we need more people to do.
How much do you feel political parties in legislative chambers shape how women legislators shape policy?
How much do you think, what, parties and?
How much do you feel political parties in legislative chambers shape how women legislators shape policy?
Well, I think that because women tend to, at least I'm only using my experience in the Senate, which is somewhat unique because we have a unique group of people, but I have found that the women are more likely to sort of rise against some of the dictates of whatever their party says and try to find some kind of compromise. That certainly happened during the shutdown. The other thing about legislative chambers is they tend to run a lot on leadership. People in charge, or the party in charge, but also the people in charge have a lot of power. So again, I have this very unique perspective of now in the Democratic side in the Senate that we have 8 of the 20 chairs are women, including the most powerful committees. So when you go to these lunches, like I get to do with the chairs because of my Joint Economic Committee chairmanship, you get to see that it feels like it's just half women there. And I think that changes some of the issues that come up. As you know, we just did the Paycheck Fairness Act, a lot of the focus on the minimum wage was on the need to raise the minimum wage, but also how it affected women. I remember doing an event, Senator Gillibrand and I did an event with a waitress from Texas, and she talked about her life, and I just come to believe that if you didn't have women running things, some of these stories would never be told. Throughout history, the women in the Senate on the issue of breast cancer came together when we found out, this was before my time, but when they found out that there wasn't research being done on certain kinds of cancers, the research subjects tended to be all men. Kay Bailey Hutchinson and Barbara Mikulski came together to work on those issues. And you just go back through history where having the women there, regardless of party, made a difference as they took on some issues that had just been left dormant that no one cared about.
Did you have difficulty receiving the women's vote in Minnesota? And how do you get women to vote for women?
Mm-hmm. I did pretty well with the women in Minnesota. You can check the polls, and the men. But I actually really, and maybe it was because my races, I just really focused on some bread and butter issues. The first time I ran to introduce myself to the voters, it was about my experience as a prosecutor. Half of them, I represented about a fourth of the state. But I think about half the state knew who I was when I ran based on my work for 8 years running the biggest prosecutor's office in Minnesota, 400 employees. And so it was a lot about my experience, but it was also back then, if you remember, there were issues of fiscal responsibility, the war in Iraq, and sort of it was the last closing years of the Bush administration. So there was a lot of focus on those issues. And then when I ran this time, back in 2006, again, I cannot say that I ran specific ads or did specific things on women's issues, because I view the economy as a big women's issue. And so I talked about making things in America and working on manufacturing and trying to bring back manufacturing, and of course get more women involved in manufacturing. That was part of it, but I just tended to really focus more on issues that transcend gender issues, if I could be honest, in how I've approached my job and what I've done. But that doesn't mean that when there are attacks like the Sandra Fluke thing and about, you know, all men sitting there in the House of Representatives talking about contraception, that we don't call it to the public's attention and fight those issues. And we've had a lot of fights on those things. So I think it's, I really enjoy working on these domestic issues and making those fights in a bigger way, at the same time knowing that that's the best way to lift women up and make sure things are fair with an even playing field, like the Paycheck Fairness Act, other things, but not that having that be the only issue that has defined what I do or what I do in the state.
And again, if you have any questions for the senator, Leslie has note cards. What are 3 indications that our nation is ready for a woman president?
I feel like I'm some kind of Jeopardy. Okay, oh, 3 indications. Oh, man.
Or
okay.
1.
Oh, no, I'm ready. Now you got to do that. Do, and I'll come up like this. I thought of 2. Okay, I got it. Okay, so I think the most obvious thing is the polls and the kind of what you're seeing, the support, and when you see Hillary Clinton, for instance, matched up against a lot of people and how well she's doing, and you see this change in how people are thinking about a woman in charge from the last time she ran and shattered the glass ceiling. Secondly, I would say the rise of women in these jobs, the fact that there are these 20 women in the Senate that are so prominent that over and over again you see examples where these women have shown leadership, and of course that filters up into having a woman run for president. If they don't think that a woman can run a company or a woman can run a state or a woman can run a committee in the United States Senate, they're not going to be quite ready mentally for them to run the country. So I think that rise in women in other positions of power, kind of the leaning in of politics and the corporate world and the nonprofit world, makes a difference. And then the third thing I would say of why they're ready to run and have a woman run is the fact that, again, women have shown this ability to get things done. It's not just the second reason I gave you, that they're in positions of power, that they've used those positions of power well. You know, they've seen, for people that cover international affairs, they've seen Angela Merkel and what she's done. They have been able to see the power of Debbie Stabenow getting that farm bill done, or Susan Collins bringing everyone, men and women, together on the shutdown. And they know that. They may not know every story, but they know some of the stories. So I think that it makes a major difference. So I would put the effectiveness, the fact that you have women in power in other capacities, and the third, the polling numbers showing that the women are, that the people of this country are ready for that.
What would you say is the most important factor, or, I'm sorry, I can't read this person's writing.
Oh, take your time.
Oh, okay. What would you say is the most important fact you presented or heard in getting the Violence Against Women's Act passed?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, for me personally, it was the story of, I'd always worked as a prosecutor. We had a big poster when you'd walk in the door that showed a woman holding her little baby that had a Band-Aid over the woman's face, showing she'd been beat up, and she's holding this little baby. And the words on the poster said, beat your wife and it's your kid that will go to jail. And just this idea that there are, of course, women victims, but that it affects entire families and entire communities. And that was really brought home to me by a case that we had where a guy, they were Russian immigrants, and the guy had killed his wife, basically chopped her up, put her in a garbage bag, and actually, maybe some of you remember this, but brought the body to Iowa from Minnesota. And he had his little girl, a 4-year-old girl, in the car with him when he came down here. And he was eventually, I think he actually turned himself in, and he was being prosecuted. But because they were immigrants and their entire family was in Russia, they came in for the funeral. The mom and then the identical twin sister of that mom. And it was the only people at the funeral besides them was me and our victim witness advocate. And what I most remember was a story of when they got off the plane and that little 4-year-old was at the airport and she ran up to the identical twin sister and hugged her and said, "Mommy, mommy, mommy." And it just makes you realize the effect of domestic violence is not limited to one victim. It is an entire family, an entire community. And so that was what I went into this debate thinking. And usually this bill has been reauthorized with strong bipartisan support. It ended up being reauthorized with strong bipartisan support. But it was an incredibly hard journey this time, and it just showed how difficult times are. And one of the sticking points, the 3 sticking points were, not surprisingly, the GLBT provision to make sure that there was equal protection there. That ended up getting in there. The U visas, which is for immigrants. That basically, and I know this, that immigrant victims, what their perpetrators do of either sexual assault, rape, or domestic violence, they say, well, if you go to the police, I'll turn you in and you'll be deported. We had a number of cases like that when I was prosecutor. And so what the U visas do is they give the immigrant victims protection so that if they go to the police, they can stay in the country and not live under that threat for a period of time. And so we upped the number of U visas and used some leftover ones so we could fulfill a quota in the bill. And then the third thing was, which was the saddest, was the tribal justice, the fact that tribal women were inordinately victims of domestic violence. And while the U.S. Attorney's offices are supposed to be doing those cases, and they do the big cases, a lot of the smaller cases, which are never small to the victim, were not being prosecuted. So what the bill said was that tribal courts could have concurrent jurisdiction, the same jurisdiction as the U.S. Attorney's offices when it came to those just the domestic violence cases. So I just couldn't believe how far and long this debate went on because of those 3 provisions. And what I loved about what the women of the Senate did, including the Republican women, is we stood by keeping the bill strong. And so this fight went on so long because we would not give in. We would not give in to weakening those provisions in the bill. And that's why we were able to pass a strong bill. And what really sustained me through that was remembering that little girl and remembering all the victims that I'd worked with as Hennepin County attorney.
We have one last question. With social media, there's a plethora of information available for opponent researchers to uncover. Have you seen any examples of women overcoming negative attacks from past social media pictures or comments? Also, how do you feel social media will affect women running for office in the future?
Well, I guess I can check my Twitter account and I'll find some mean thing on there on any day. I think it's interesting when we first had, remember when we first had blogs? And people would put stuff out. I remember the Star Tribune newspaper actually was covering blogs for a while, and they would have some stuff was really honest and stuff was totally made up. And it wasn't until the reporters start getting made up attacks on them that they stopped the coverage of the blogs. And so I think social media, of course, serves a very good purpose. It is a way, I love having a Facebook page because you're able to put out there some things about what you're doing that maybe the media won't otherwise cover. You're able to watch people duke it out on Facebook, which is my favorite thing. So if you ask about overcoming, there are people that just write the meanest things on there. And what I love about Facebook is there's this whole cadre. I think of mostly older women. I don't think they're that political, but they're on my Facebook page. And whenever those guys write it, they're like, Ed, Facebook is not a back alley for thugs. Just get off the page, Ed. Get off the page. There's a particular man named Ed that does this. And so I think part of this, part of the fighting back has to come from the realization that while there are incredibly important information on there, that not all of it is true, and that you need your own people on there that are willing. You need enough volume so you just don't get attacked by something that simply is not true. And that's part of the key here. And Twitter, of course, is the same thing. In fact, it's even harder because it's more anonymous. Facebook, at least you're supposed to be identified by a name. So I view it as a positive overall, like everyone else does. I really do. It's a way of getting things out. I have numerous people, especially in rural areas, that know about stuff I'm doing because of the fact that we have the Facebook. But I think at the same time, it makes you have to overcome things. And I'm trying, maybe you guys can think of an example, but obviously there's examples all the time of people having to immediately do, in the Bill Clinton days, the rapid response team, when you get attacked with something that's not true. And that is one place, of course, where things are spread, but of course the other is with these ads. And I'm just going to sort of segue that question into the end of what I see as the biggest challenge right now for American politics, and the biggest thing that's going to stop, I think, a lot of women from running and a lot of women from getting into power, and that's the money that's been allowed to come in since Citizens United. We are in a stage now where Kay Hagan in North Carolina has had $10 million spent against her, and it is only April, and she's already had $10 million. There's no race ever in the history of America that's had that much independent expenditures that early. And so obviously there's going to be super PACs on the Democratic side as well, but I think that issue of money in politics is something that no one can deny as we go forward. And the solution to it is a constitutional amendment. We were just talking here earlier that the transparency is important. I'd love to pass that bill we have on transparency, so at least you can immediately find out who's giving the money and where it's coming from for these independent expenditures. But I promise you, once we do that, if we ever do that, it's not going to solve the problem of the money. Certain people will just give money in certain states and not in other states, and there's just going to, the money, and especially in light of this new decision that will allow for certain donors to basically give an unlimited amount, that the wealthiest donors, I think it's just really disturbing what's happening, and just the antithesis of what Iowa and Minnesota stand for when it comes to caucuses and grassroots politics and this Harkin and Wellstonian idea, or maybe even a Jesse Ventura idea, that you should be able to run really from nothing, that you should be able to go out there like Paul Wellstone did and get little kids to, I still remember his amazing ad where he talked fast through the ad because he didn't have enough money to pay for an ad, the fast talking Paul ad, or the ad where he had little kids trying to write checks in their high chairs to demonstrate what was going on, or Jesse Ventura, because we have generous public financing in Minnesota and matching funds able to come from nowhere, whether you think it's good or bad. That's something about American politics that's always been a grassroots piece of our politics, and I just don't want it defeated by these a few people in this country that are able to inject like $1 billion into our politics, and that's where we're headed right now. And I just really search deep, and by the way, it's going to happen on both sides, so I'm not being a Pollyanna about this. And what it does is it brings people to extremes because they have to suck up to those few people that have the money that they're putting in, whether it's a special interest, whether it's a view. And it's so bad for those people who want to work in the middle. It truly is. And you see it now in the Republican Party, where there's even some of the business interests don't like the direction where some people are going to the far right. And so my hope is that we get some kind of grassroots movement. I can't think of a better place that it could start than Iowa, to get a constitutional amendment going on putting some kind of limits. And of course, I'm co-sponsoring some in the Senate on this, so we can start a movement across the country. And we aren't naive. It will be so difficult to do. But we have to start somewhere to send this message that, politicians can't be bought, that this is really about representing the people of this country. So social media aside, I think that is our biggest challenge right now in a democracy, and one that we have to confront. So thank you for having me.